Every day, the world gets a little weirder and a lot more awesome. Cool Stuff Daily takes a look at everything from mining in space to the latest in the fight against cancer to how AI is, basically changing everything. It's all the cool stuff you didn't know you needed to know. Join us for Cool Stuff Daily as we take a quick look at science, tech, and the wait, what stories that make you sound way smarter at dinner. Subscribe to Cool Stuff Daily now, because the future's happening fast, and it's way too fun to miss.
Welcome to the Aspects of History podcast with me, your host, Nathen Amin. Today we are going to be looking at an exciting roundup of some of the most brilliant 16th century books that were released in the last 12 months. Joining me today are going to be two experts in this period. Sarah Gristwood is an eminent journalist, author, historian, a true titan of the Tudor world, who has published extensively on this subject. She has covered people like Arbella Stewart, Elizabeth I, the women of the Wars of the Roses, and of course, her legendary book, The Tudors in Love. Stephen Veerapen, likewise, is also an experienced author and historian, both in the fiction and non-fiction realm. He has covered subjects like Anna of Denmark, Mary, Queen of Scots, and of course his recent book, The Wisest Fool, looking at James VI/I. We are very lucky to be joined by them today. And so, without further ado, here is today's show. Right, well, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. I'm glad today to be joined by my co-hosts for this episode, Stephen and Sarah, where we're going to discuss, a roundup of some of the books in 2025 that have caught our eye in the Tudor world. So first of all, Sarah, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Been talking about Arbella Stewart a lot in the last few days, which is nice. So that's the very end of the Tudor dynasty.
Yeah, and I suppose that's one of your biggest selling and most popular books. How come she's back in the ether?
Well, I don't quite know. She had her, so to speak, 450th birthday a few days ago, but no one except me seems to know that. It's just as if, by complete coincidence, the entire world, not the entire world, the history world, suddenly thought, oh, guess what, Arbella Stewart. Anyway, I'm not complaining.
Well, again, and I suppose because you have joined the Substack revolution, I did see that you were able to put out quite an interesting historical, I suppose it's a bit of a memoir and a bit of history about Arbella and your journey. So if anybody's listening and they do want to find out a bit more about that very interesting figure, the titan of the later Tudor period, check out Sarah's Substack, check out her work. So Stephen, also welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you, Nathan. I am very well. Slightly damp after walking about Glasgow this afternoon, but otherwise very well. I have also been busy this week, not speaking about Arbella, but speaking about her cousin James. So yes, I had a very James-focused week this week and last week.
Well, and I suppose you're probably the correct person from the correct background to be talking about the Stuarts. Kind of like how I always like to think that I'm perhaps was born in the right place to talk about the early Welsh Tudors.
Nathan, I just discovered today an obscure fact that if you leave Glasgow and head directly south as the crow flies, the first country you hit is Wales. It's not England.
There's also a very interesting fact. I think it's something like Edinburgh is actually further west than Bristol. But because of the way that we look at our maps, it's kind of Britain's been straightened up a little bit.
Yes, we fix it. We correct it for some reason.
Goodness.
Yeah, there we go. Fascinating geographical bit of trivia for you on this history podcast. Right, well, let's get down to it. So, it has been yet another exciting year, I think, for the release of Tudor books. I think it's fair to say that Tudor Mania is really not going anywhere anytime soon, is it? And I guess for the people like us on this podcast who work in the Tudor field or work in the Tudor adjacent field even, because I know that, Stephen, you go further into the Stuarts, I myself go backwards as the youth era into the Wars of the Roses. That's a good thing, isn't it, that Tudor Mania is still here?
Well, it's good for us. I mean, there is a case for saying that actually the Stuarts, some of the other eras, should get a bit more of a look in. And it's an interesting question why they don't. But it works for us. And I don't think it's going to change anytime soon.
Well, why do you think that the Stuarts perhaps don't get as much of a look in? Or is that too big a question for this particular podcast? What do you think, Stephen?
I think it is because the Tudors have been so popular for so long that there's a kind of self-fulfilling thing going on. People know them, and therefore the market exists, and so the market keeps being fed. I think that's it. I've spoken about this before, and I think there's something about the iconography of the Tudors that just has really captured the public imagination. People know Henry VIII. I mean, famously, I can't remember who said it, but someone said that Henry VIII is the only English king who's recognisable by his silhouette alone, and I think that's probably true. So he's so iconic to look at that people don't even need to know the history.
Yeah.
They can learn it very easily because there's so much material, but just from the visual image, they are pulled into it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, having, like you, written a bit, I've only written a bit, but about the 15th century, I think it's partly to do with the material we have available. That the Tudors are the first family, the first dynasty, for whom we don't just have the amazing stories, heaven knows you get that in the medieval era, but we also have the letters, the documents that show what they were thinking and feeling about it. And that's what everyone really wants. They want to know, or to feel they know, what these people were like. When I was a journalist interviewing actors, Hollywood actors all the time, no one ever asked their opinion on this or that or what they did. They asked what they were like. And we feel we've got the tools to know that about the Tudors, which we don't about earlier dynasties. And I'm not even so sure about the Stuarts.
Well, I think that something else happens with the Stuarts and the later dynasties. There's so much material. I mean, if you look at something like the Civil Wars and Charles I, you can get lost in the amount of documentary material. So it almost has you go in the opposite direction. Rather than having too little, you've got too much. Whereas the Tudors might be that kind of sweet spot where you've got the juicy ambassadorial dispatches and things, but you don't have too much information. So there's still a lot of guesswork and speculation and all the fun stuff.
I think for me, what I'm always quite impressed at by authors who write of the later Tudor period, and certainly all the way up to the modern period, is just the abundance of material that you have to work with. What I particularly enjoy about the 15th century and the Wars of the Roses is we start to have a bit more insight into the day-to-day life of the king, the queen, through things such as the Paston letters. But it's enough to add a bit of colour, but there's a lot more interpretation and thoughts and a knowable quality that goes on. I look at the reign of Henry VIII and where do you even begin to sift through the sheer volume of material? It's quite intimidating, to be honest.
Hey, I wrote a book about Winston Churchill. Don't even go there. I mean, Henry VIII has nothing on anyway.
I'm working on Henry VIII at the moment, and this was not deliberate, I promise. I was looking at the proofs in a break between meetings and things that I had today, and you are both mentioned separately. And Nathan, you are mentioned to do with fireworks. You must have at some point told me about fireworks at Elizabeth of York's coronation, I think. And Sarah, you're mentioned in the context of the Tudors in love, so you both get a mention. But when I was working on it and researching it and everything, it was the most daunting thing was the sheer volume of information and the sheer volume of secondary material that exists. So much has been written about Henry VIII and about the Tudors, and I'm sure you could say the same about Winston Churchill as well.
Well, regarding the fireworks, what I will mention is this idea that Henry VII was the first person in the UK to use fireworks at the coronation of Elizabeth of York in 1487, and it's one of those fun facts to roll out every November. It's a little bit naughty because the concept of fireworks that they would have used is slightly different to, a rocket going up into the sky and exploding colourful lights all across the sky. I think it's literally the word firework. And one of the things that Henry had was a giant red dragon that would breathe flames of fire into the Thames. So it literally was firework. But it is an interesting fact. We do know that the Chinese were during this period already working with gunpowder to create fireworks. And I think it just shows a bit of Henry VII's more cosmopolitan outlook, where he was looking to bring more of a European and beyond culture into England, because that was his upbringing. He was an outward-facing king, for better or for worse. But anyway, this is not a podcast about Henry VII, so I've got to be careful not to, as the host, to lead myself astray. Let's get back to books. That's what we're here for. So it has been an exciting year. Stephen, do you want to tell us about some of the books that perhaps you've enjoyed this year, that you've enjoyed digging into?
So the first one I was going to talk about was Joanne Paul's book on Thomas More. Now this, I don't know if it's because when I was a child I went to a Catholic primary school and I was raised Catholic. I'm not religious at all anymore, but they must have their hooks in somehow. So I still have an interest in Thomas More, Mary Queen of Scots as well. But Thomas More, I think, is one of those figures who has suffered in recent years by the Wolf Hall effect, I think. He has been kind of castigated as this monstrous persecutor and torturer. We've done a 180 from A Man for All Seasons, really. And with the success of Wolf Hall, he is the figure that emerged covered in, not in glory. Thomas Cromwell managed to do that, but has emerged covered in something far worse than glory. And it's not unusual now to see people online treating the Wolf Hall version of Thomas More as the real Thomas More. That was the real version, this horrible, sort of evil version. Who was it that played him in the series? I can't remember. It might come back to me at some point who played him in the TV series. But I think Joanne Paul's book acts as a kind of, not a fiction in that it's trying to be a hagiography or anything, but something that puts him much more in the context of his time, which is needed. And Diarmaid MacCulloch's book about Thomas Cromwell did this for Cromwell. It's a kind of post-Wolf Hall study of Cromwell that looks at the good and the bad. That's what Joanne Paul does for Thomas More. And it's just a beautifully written book. It's just wonderful.
Mm. No, I totally agree for what that's worth. Of course, Thomas More, first of all, he was the saint in A Man for All Seasons. Then, as you say, he was the complete villain in that very powerful, persuasive entity that was the Wolf Hall trilogy. And no, I absolutely agree that Joanne Paul's book recasts him as a man who, rightly or wrongly, lived and died by his beliefs. And I really enjoyed the way also that it explored his world, the world not just of Henry VIII's court, but of London and the Inns of Court and the great guild companies.
Yes, it gets so right, I think, that balance between Thomas More, the politician, and Thomas More, the family man, and Thomas More, the intellectual, and the European intellectual. All these facets to the same man, she just brings out. She finds the light and the dark, the shading.
She really does, and I really like Joanne as a person and as an historian. And what I really respect about her work is, as you say, we've got this saint versus sinner kind of dichotomy, and she's nailed down that murky middle of what is quite an inscrutable character at times, quite a hypocritical character in himself. She really has gone to work, dig deep into the sources, to reveal as close to a Thomas More as I think we can get. And it becomes quite fashionable these days to try and claim that every book is the best or every book is definitive. But I do think this is now the definitive biography of Thomas More. You know, she really has produced that go-to book that anyone should consult if they are looking for any ideas on Thomas More, and not just the end of his life, the early part of his reign, his background, his upbringing, his early start at the Tudor court, where he made an enemy very briefly out of Henry VII because he was quite a bold young man. And of course, she does touch on Thomas More and his work, which often gets overlooked. How Thomas More was one of the people who shaped the narrative around Richard III, for example. So yeah, I think that's an excellent place to begin, and quite frankly, quite an appropriate place to begin, because this year has been so long that it feels like Joanne's book did come out quite a while ago, and it was, of course, at the beginning of this year, and it set the tone pretty much for the rest of the 12 months that followed.
Mm.
What about you, Sarah? Any books that have taken your eye?
Yes, absolutely. And at some point, while we're talking about the early mid-Tudor period, I'm going to put in a word for Nicola Clarke's The Waiting Game, writing about the ladies, the women who served Henry's wives, but who, of course, had fascinating existences in their own right. But really, the books, the 2 or 3 that I want to pick out, sorry, I'm being greedy, hogging so many books, but this year has, and I think very rightly, seen an explosion of interest in the closing years of the Tudor dynasty and the years that moved them on to the Stuart. And to me, that's always been a great source of fascination, and B, I could never understand quite why it wasn't 1603 and what came before and after wasn't more followed. Because it is not only fascinating, it's vitally important in transforming a medieval England into the first stages of a modern Britain. But somehow it never used to get covered that much. Maybe it was something about the personality of the first Stuart king, James I and VI. Maybe it was what then, as we know, so quickly happened. The Stuarts went down the toilet, basically, at least temporarily. But I'm delighted to say that this year, that there have been 3 books covering those years. There's been Tracy Borman's The Stolen Crown, which it covers the succession crisis of 1603, what came after and to some degree before. But the really important thing is I think that it explodes that old Ladybird history book view of the succession to the crown as something unquestioned, unquestionable. It went do one, father to son or failing that daughter. And Of course, it was nothing like that. It was all about politics, confusion, different ideologies, that as Elizabeth I was dying, not only did no one agree on who should succeed her, they didn't even agree on the criteria by which that person should be chosen. Strictest right of blood, parliament, the dying wish of the old monarch. Anyway, and Tracy also does an invaluable thing in exposing just how that in this case that myth's come into being. That a lot of it is due to the contemporary history written by Camden, who perpetrated the idea that Elizabeth had named James, which is probably pretty much of a fancy story. However, also, there's the wonderful book by Gareth Russell, Queen James, about James himself. And I just love everything from the title to the skill with which Gareth Russell combines James's personal life, which is what he's chiefly writing about. The subtitle is The Life and Loves of Britain's First King, and the really significant political events that were going on then. The third one would be Anna Whitelock's James the Sun Rising, James I and the Dawn of a Global Britain, about the start of both A of Britain and B of the Empire. But I'm very struck by the way that we are at last getting to grips with 1603 and Near Offa, this very vital period in our history.
And I suppose, Stephen, as somebody who has written about this subject, you of course released The Wisest Fool a couple of years back. I'm sure you are pleased to see this sudden outpouring of interest in a subject quite dear to your Scottish heart, I suppose.
Yes, and one reason I think for this seeming outburst of interest in James is the 400th anniversary of his death. I was at a conference at Glasgow University a couple of months ago now, and there was so much interest, and young people, like students, interest, young students, and older students as well, but just a lot of interest in James and various aspects of his life. And I think this interest in 1603 as well, and this new questioning of it, actually reveals something about James, as well as Camden. Camden was employed by James, but James was a master of propaganda, which has never really been appreciated. I mean, we see it with the Gowrie conspiracy in 1600 when he's having people, politicians, preachers, tell this official narrative about how he escaped death. And it was very questionable. We see him do it with the North Berwick witch trials when he is having this News from Scotland pamphlet published in England in which he's the hero of the hour who narrowly escaped death. We see it when he is publicising the gunpowder conspiracy, the powder treason as it was called, in which he narrowly escaped death. So almost everything we know about James, or what we think we know about James, is what James wanted us to know and what James was having trumpeted. And part of that was it was God's will and Elizabeth's will that he become King of England. This was part of his project to unite the two countries as well. He spoke up in Parliament saying that God had decided to reunite Scotland and England, which had been sort of for centuries disunited, but they had in the ancient world been united. So he was very politicised in doing this. He was absolutely promoting this smooth succession idea because it suited his political agenda. So yeah, James was an absolute prince of propaganda. I'm glad people are looking at him now, exposing him a little bit.
Hi, Nathan here. Please forgive my interruption, but I just wanted to let you know that here at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews featuring the brightest and best historians and storytellers. Authors featured have included Lucy Worsley, Ben McIntyre, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription featuring 6 issues costs just £9.99 or $9.99 for those of you across the pond. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe or to gift a subscription to friends or family. Now, back to our show. So we often have this catch-all term Tudor propaganda, which is something often levelled at my guy, Henry VII. I suppose we should be discussing Stuart propaganda very much as well. I mean, James, of course, was a direct descendant of Henry VII. He learnt from the best, I guess. He learnt from the Tudors on how to shape your narrative, how to sell your story to the people that you are looking to govern, to rule, especially when they do not know you, which is something he shares with Henry VII.
His son was no good at it, I should point out. His son struggled to do this, so it was very much a Jacobean talent rather than a...
That's what I was going to ask. It's a genuine question. I know so little I can't tell you about the Stuarts after James I and VI. But what went wrong with Charles I trying to present a narrative? I genuinely have no idea, but I'd love to.
I think the narrative that Charles was trying to sell was not done with any great skill. So I think Charles I gets a very bad press, in some ways with good reason, but he lacked the kind of political skill that his father had in dealing with Parliament and so on. But by that same token, Parliament and a lot of parliamentarians were a lot more stiff-necked than they had been in James's reign. So you had two very, I suppose, stiff-necked groups, the royalists and then these parliamentarians, neither of which were willing to back down on anything. So Charles was actually more flexible, I think, or willing to be more flexible than history's given him credit for, but he had the misfortune of being up against people who were as inflexible as he could prove himself to be. So it was a recipe for disaster. I think he was the wrong king for that particular time, because what we see, if we look at what he was doing with Scotland, I mean, I'm speaking about witches again because I've been doing it for weeks, but when he tried to impose a specific type of justice area, he called it, claiming he was reinvigorating the old justice areas, what he was really trying to do was push the English legal system and the assizes on Scotland. And what happened as almost an accident was there was a sudden outbreak of witch panics, and all these accusations flew in, and this was because a new legal machine had been opened up. No one knew quite how to deal with it. So he was incompetent, I think, in trying to enforce things on his various countries. And what really kicked off then all the problems was not just the English Parliament. I think that was the view for a long time. It was Charles versus the English Parliament. What you actually, I mean, it's kicked off in Scotland and it kicked off in Ireland first. And he was in absolutely no position to deal with those problems and the English Parliament at the same time. So he was just the wrong man for a very, very turbulent time. I know people debate back and forth. Did these problems go back to James? Can we blame him? Did they go back to Elizabeth? Can we blame her? Ultimately, I think Elizabeth and James probably managed to kick a lot of problems down the road successfully. Neither of them were really all that concerned with solving them. Charles, unfortunately, was not the right man to solve them, but that's when they boiled up.
Yeah, and I think what this is pointing out is, even though this is obviously a Tudor book roundup, is the absurdity sometimes of pinning in our past into these neat little boxes, because history is certainly not something that can be restricted or confined to certain dates. Either side of that Tudor reign, of course, Elizabeth doesn't die and that ends the Tudors' issues, political machinations, etc. overnight. That is still felt 50 years down the line. And same with Henry VII. No matter how much Henry VII wanted to portray the Wars of the Roses as yesterday's problems, it was anything but. Henry VIII was still feeling the effects from what took place 30 years before he was even born. But I guess, history it would get quite overwhelming if we would putting it down into bite sizes. But I do like how there is now this world open to all three of the authors on this call, that we kind of we step over these boundaries. We are able to explore beyond what historically would have been our remit. People call me a Tudor historian. I'm not really. I mean, I'm a 15th century historian that kind of straddles the reign of Henry VII with Richard III. It's not a neat box you can fit me in. And similarly, at the other end of the Tudor reign, I guess both of you can also look beyond.
I think, again, this is something that James was very keen on. If we look again at 1603, he was absolutely insistent that this was not a turning point. This was not everything changing. He almost might have adopted Elizabeth's semper eadem, always the same. He wanted to stress the continuity and that any union of Scotland and England would be a minor bit of business. It would just be a natural progression. It wasn't anything revolutionary or anything. That's what he was trying to promote.
Well, look where he's laid to rest. He was laid to rest, wasn't he, in the very same crypt that holds the coffins of his ancestors, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, in the wonderful, beautiful Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey. He is stressing dynastic legitimacy. Henry VII builds the Lady Chapel to create this architectural propaganda piece to try and demonstrate how great the Tudors are. And 100 years later, James places himself in there to stress, I am with, he wouldn't have called them the Tudors, but I am with my notable relations. I am with Mary, Queen of Scots. I am with Elizabeth I, Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII, Elizabeth of York, masters of propaganda, as you say.
Mm. And of course, we all think about these people with our hindsight, looking back on the dynasties and how they moved on, what they contributed to the future. But very often their own preferred currency was the past. The Tudors were all about proving their legitimacy by looking right back to, well, Arthur and Brutus, never mind whether they existed or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose that brings us around kind of neatly to one of my choices for a very interesting book this year, which is The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, Interpreting Image and Perception by Helen Harrison. And I think this is actually quite a fascinating book. You know, cards on the table, I don't find much personally appealing about the travails and the tribulations of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, or perhaps more accurately, his 6 queens, we should say. It's not a subject that desperately appeals to myself. But when I did read this book by Helen, it was fascinating because it's not a history book about Anne Boleyn in that it obviously covers her life, her marriage, her death, but it's what it says on the title. It's looking at how her image has been perceived both in her own lifetime and in the centuries that have followed. And it's fascinating to read about Anne Boleyn on stage during, the Stuart period, during the Victorian period, those famous films that have covered our lifetimes about Anne, and how she's been reshaped and remoulded for different generations, literally up to the 6 musical. And it was deeply fascinating. As I say, it's not a book about history as much as it's a book about the historiography. And I think she's cottoned on to something there. That is something that deeply fascinates me, again, about Richard III and Henry VII, how they've actually come down to us. So that's certainly a book I would deeply recommend to anyone who is looking to learn a bit more about Anne, even if they think perhaps they're a bit tired by the consistent output there is about that middle Tudor period, I suppose.
I am fascinated by Anne Boleyn and the travails of Henry and his 6 queens. I remain fascinated. And I loved this book. I loved it because I think for a lot of us, before we were reading history and primary sources and all of these wonderful books that have come out, we were watching the films and we were seeing the adaptations and we were seeing Anne of the Thousand Days with Genevieve Bujold, we were seeing the Tudors with Natalie Dormer, and then maybe Shakespeare, seeing adaptations of Henry the Eighth. It was the 1980s filmed version of it. So this was not just an interesting book in its own right, but a trip down memory lane in a lot of ways, as you could see some of these performances discussed and see how perceptions of Anne Boleyn have changed over time. Because I know every queen, of Henry VIII has her fans, and with good reason. But Anne Boleyn is the one that I think most people, even outside of Tudorology, are familiar with. Everyone's heard of Anne Boleyn. Everyone has a perception of what she was like. So it is nice to see where that came from and how that has changed over time. It's really, really fascinating stuff.
So what about you, Sarah? Do you have any other books on your list or any other thoughts about Anne?
Well, only, about we can't stop having thoughts about Anne, really, can we? That's the weird thing. My social media feed is covered with Anne Boleyn fans, Anne Boleyn Christmas ornaments, crocheted Anne Boleyn. I think my favourite all-time was an Anne Boleyn execution birthday cake featuring raspberry jam. But I think the extraordinary thing about Anne Boleyn in the end is how little we really know about her. And I'm never sure if she's so fascinating despite that or because of it. Because we know a huge amount about her effect on other people, on the country, on the map of Europe, but we have staggeringly little in the way of actual writings by her, even certain portraits. So no, I think that's why she stays the woman of mystery. Yeah.
Yes, just that medal. So we've got this incredibly famous woman, but only a very damaged contemporary image of what she looks like. That actually brings me on, if you don't mind, Nathan, to the other book, which is Sylvia Barbara Soberton's book about portraiture and the secrets of the Tudor portraits, which again I liked because not for a lot of reasons, but one of them was her discussion of the famous bee necklace portrait, which I had always read and just taken for granted was a copy of a lost original. You know, this famous image of Anne, always recorded as a copy of a lost original. And what Sylvia does in that book is question that and whether this is actually almost a kind of reverse engineered depiction of Anne Boleyn based on face models for Elizabeth. So we've got these Elizabethan painters trying to not copy a lost original of her mother, but to reimagine what her mother might have looked like based on her own face. And I think that's actually a really convincing argument that makes sense.
Yeah, well, actually, there's a lot more work being done and to be done on the portraiture, isn't there? Of course, Elizabeth Goldring's just got out a wonderful, huge book on Holbein, who, of course, did so much to contribute to our image, literally, of the Tudors.
Yeah, an excellent book that is. We were at the launch together, Sarah, and it does look like a fascinating project about Holbein. For myself, I'd never really appreciated the Tudor art until I moved to London and visited the National Portrait Gallery. Because I did not know that it was free, and I did not know you could just wander in. And of course, the Tudor Gallery is there on the first floor. You could be in looking at Tudor portraiture within seconds if you're ever wandering past the Trafalgar Square area. And I do now pop in quite often because we've all seen the famous portraits up on screen. We all can picture in our mind the Henry VII, the Richard III, the Henry VIII, and the Elizabeth I portraits. But to see the cracked oil canvases up close, to really see the craftsmanship, it really does, I think, open up a whole new world of Tudor historical study, and that is something that I am looking forward to learning more about in future. So I will certainly have to pick up a copy of Sylvia Barbara Soberton's book. And yeah, I do implore people, if they do have an interest in art, definitely check out Elizabeth Goldring's Holbein, because he is, of course, the master, the man of this period.
I think actually Holbein's responsible for our fascination with the Tudors. I think if we did not have those images, the image of Henry, the images of his wives, the images of his courtiers, we wouldn't have the interest that we do in that dynasty.
I think that's a very good point, because I know that for earlier centuries, for the women of the late 15th century, for example, one of the huge problems is often that we don't have those very sympathetic, those very human-feeling images. And I think that does colour our perception more than we'd like to admit.
I think the same problem with a lot of the Scottish monarchs don't have these iconic images surviving of them, and so they are lesser known. We do with James IV, but it's not as good as a Holbein. So similarly with James V.
Yeah, and I do think that it's a shame that Henry VII and Margaret Beaufort were not around during Holbein's peak period, because we do have portraiture of those people, but in later life, you know, I would love to see a portraiture of Margaret Beaufort, a gambling, wine-drinking, party-loving girl in her 20s, rather than that severe image she wanted to portray of herself in later life. I think that would have done wonders for her image and her modern reputation.
Yes, definitely. I'm ashamed to admit how much my own picture of Margaret Beaufort is coloured by that one clear surviving image. It's shameful, but it's true.
Yeah, and again, Henry VII with that portrait in 1505, painted by Herman Rink. It's painted of Henry at 48 years old, widowed, deeply ill in the final stages of his life, and he looks shifty. He looks cunning. He's exuding power and wealth. But again, I think it's done damage to his reputation. This was a man who at 28 years old managed to marshal a force and an army to invade England. He must have had some charisma about him. There must have been something that appealed to his followers and allowed him to keep his reign for 24 years. And we don't have that image of him as a young man. And I think this does damage people's reputations.
No, well, really, the question about Henry VII to me is why he isn't a romantic hero. Because his story has everything. You know, sent over the seas as a boy, coming back to, quote, rescue his kingdom and his wife. Really, it should be one of the big romantic tales. But guess what? It could hardly be further.
Well, you don't need to convince me, Sarah, but I'll put the blame at William Shakespeare, who, of course, very famously stepped over Henry VII when he was doing his history plays, and I think that has resulted in Henry not perhaps having that place.
He comes back, though, under Charles. He comes back with John Ford and Perkin Warbeck, the play. We get that's all.
Yeah, he does. What we need is we need a new, exciting fictional portrayal of him, because that is always the way that captures people's attentions of Henry VII. There have been a few done in the 20th century, but we need a new, great, exciting, engrossing fiction novelist to put pen to paper. Anyone on this call want to give it a go?
I say the same thing with James. This is James VI and first. We picture him as an old man, kind of middle-aged man. We see the coronation portrait of James, and he looks very weathered in it. We don't so much look at the portraits of they exist. There are portraits of the young James VI and the teenage James VI, but people don't know them as much as they know the English painted portraits of him in his coronation robes and all that, sitting on his throne with his crown off on the table beside, his helmet off on the table beside him, looking knackered. People don't think of him as a young man. But again, as with Henry VII, so many stories, so many kind of adventures and things. That's one thing that Gareth's book does really well, is bring out his adventurous young side.
Yeah, and I think as you bring this this book review to a close, it's been a very fascinating discussion. I just want to give a shout out to a few other books that have caught my eye this year. Going back to the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, we have The Last Yorkists by Richard Anderton. I think this is a fascinating and very vivid and masterful exploration of Henry Tudor's struggle to overcome all of those lingering Yorkist threats that he faced. I think Richard Anderton is able to put across a very balancing and thrilling read. I think it's a very good companion piece, personally, to shout myself out, of my own book, Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders, because it shows that Henry VII did not lead England into peace by winning at Bosworth Field. And it's a very good companion piece as well to another new book that's out in November the 15th, so this will be out by the time you listen to this podcast. It is The King's Traitor, Reginald Pole and the Tudors by Helen Hyde. And we know those Poles, they did cause Henry VIII some trouble during his reign. So I think that's going to be, and in fact it is, I've read it, it's another revelatory experience that again unpicks the Tudor myth that everything was A-OK once they became kings/queens. Do either of you have any other books that you want to give a hat tip to?
I do, on the subject of Anne Boleyn from earlier on, which is going to be Sophie Bacchus-Waterman's book on Elizabeth Boleyn, Anne's mother, which I thought was fantastic. And just written like a novel. Again, there it just is fabulous in terms of the scenes it sets, the way it brings her character to life. And I saw that Sophie said that some people have criticised the speculation because there's very fragmentary evidence, but this is a book that is very clear when it's speculating and very clear as to the reasons why and what the evidence is. So I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, and I think Sophie's definitely one of our up-and-coming historians. She's got a fascinating mind for the period, and you're right, it is definitely a much-needed book that does change the perspective somewhat on the Boleyn dynasty.
No, I look forward to reading that. It's a wonderful subject and one that should have been done before.
Yeah, so I think that concludes our Tudor book roundup. There are, of course, many other wonderful books that have come out this year as well, including by authors like Claire Jackson, Lauren Johnson, Amy Licence, Heather R. Darcy has put out a couple of books on the Queens. We do implore you all to please check out the books that we have mentioned, and definitely to keep on buying as many of these books as you can. And if you would ever be so kind as well to look into our own books and our back catalogue. Christmas is coming. Please do consider asking your relatives for a book for Christmas. Just as a final question, are either of you two actually working on anything at the moment? Are you taking a much needed rest from your exploits of the previous few years?
Well, I'm juggling two possible things ahead at the moment. One of them is Tudor, and one very definitely not. It's early 20th century, which is my other bag. How about you, Stephen?
Interesting, very interesting. Early 20th century, you'll have to tell me about it off records later. I am currently working through the proofs on Overlord, which is a biography of Henry VIII. But before people yawn, and we've read it before, I've discovered quite a lot in the Scottish sources
Ooh.
and Welsh sources and Irish sources that have a lot to say about Henry and his wives that aren't usually looked at. And I'm particularly interested, obviously, in what Henry was saying to the Scots and what he was saying about Scotland. And probably to no one's surprise, it wasn't good. It was very much, I am the owner of Scotland, and the Scottish kings are client kings, and they owe me homage. So there's some fascinating stuff that just isn't generally touched in biographies of Henry.
Can I actually say as a wrap that, because I think that is what the real message of some of this year's best books has been about, that there is a slight move to pass beyond the ordinary sources that we've all chewed up and digested a million times, and also to try and put English events, Tudor's English, not British, in a slightly broader global context. And I think that's absolutely vital and the way ahead.
Thank you all for listening today. Links, as always, are in the show notes. Please share the podcast with friends and family, and if you do want to get in touch with us, please do so through our website at aspectsofhistory.com. Until then, thank you so much for joining us.